Help me! Get me out of here!
I'm here! Hold on!
Please, hurry!
Just a little more!
He clawed at the wood above his face, screaming into 6 feet of silence, certain nobody on earth was listening. Above him, a woman he'd never met was already digging, chasing a warning she couldn't explain, toward a grave she was never supposed to find. Before we go deeper, Ji-hoon poured that drink believing loyalty means nothing once it's inconvenient. If you believe real loyalty doesn't come with an expiration date, hit subscribe and like this video right now. Only the fakes, the backstabbers, and Ji-hoon's people would scroll past without smashing that button. Kang Min-jae used to say there were only 2 kinds of people in Seoul, the ones who owed him money and the ones who hadn't met him yet. He said it at parties, at funerals, once at his own mother's birthday dinner, and every single time, the room laughed like his jokes were oxygen and they'd all been holding their breath. That's what fear does when it's dressed up in a nice suit. It gets applause. By 35, Min-jae ran half the shipping ports in Busan and the entirety of what people were and weren't allowed to whisper in Seoul. His empire moved on 3 currencies: cash, silence, and consequences. Men who crossed him didn't vanish into rumor. They vanished into the Han River, weighted down and fashionably late to their own disappearance. He called this quality control. His enemies called it Tuesday. But even kings keep diaries. Min-jae's was a leather-bound ledger he'd filled for over a decade. Names, numbers, dates, the entire skeleton of Seoul's rotten underbelly written in his own tidy handwriting. Senators who golfed on his dime. Corporations who used his shipping containers like personal laundromats for money too dirty to touch sunlight. He called it his retirement plan. Everyone else, if they'd been smart enough to see it coming, would have called it a countdown. The night the countdown ended, Seoul was drowning in rain, the kind that seems personal, like the sky had opinions about him and had finally decided to share them. Ji-hoon poured the last drink of the night, a decade of shared soju, shared secrets, shared blood that apparently wasn't as thick as advertised, and Min-jae drank it without a second thought, because that's what a decade of trust buys you, the privilege of not tasting the sedative until it's already rewriting your pulse. He woke up in the dark. Not turn off the lights dark, not powers out dark. This was a dark with weight, a dark that sat on his chest like a debt collector who'd finally caught up to him. 6 feet of Korean soil pressed down above a wooden lid 2 inches from his nose, patient as a loan shark who knows you're not going anywhere. His watch had stopped at 11:47, the exact minute he'd later realize his own men had decided his usefulness had a shelf life. He punched the lid. Once, twice. Splinters bit into his knuckles, and for the first time since he was 19 years old and still afraid of things that weren't currency, Kang Min-jae felt real, uncut fear, the kind with no negotiation clause. Fear doesn't care how many men you've buried. It just wants to return the favor. 9,000 kilometers of irrelevant geography away, though right now, only inches of very relevant dirt away. Amara stood in an abandoned cemetery at midnight, holding a shovel that had clearly seen better decades and a flashlight running on its last, most dramatic battery. She wasn't the superstitious type. She'd moved to South Korea on a teaching visa that paid her just enough to afford noodles and homesickness in equal measure, and in 8 months she'd learned that cursed was usually just the local word for nobody wants to deal with this. But 3 hours ago, an old man had grabbed her wrist outside a convenience store, soaked through, eyes like a man who'd been personally introduced to hell and hadn't enjoyed the tour. "If you hear knocking beneath the ground tonight," he'd rasped, "don't run." Then he was gone, swallowed by the rain like a joke nobody got to finish. She should have gone home. She almost did. Then she heard it. 3 slow knocks, rising from the earth itself, followed by silence, followed by 3 more. Not wind. Not her imagination working overtime on too little sleep. A rhythm. Deliberate. Human. Desperate. So here she was, digging in a graveyard the whole village avoided after dark, chasing a warning that made absolutely no logical sense, and somewhere below her shovel, in the very grave she'd chosen without knowing why, Kang Min-jae was running out of air, running out of time, and about to find out that the last thing standing between him and a very permanent silence was a stranger's stubborn refusal to walk away from something she couldn't explain. If you've ever ignored a gut feeling because it sounded crazy, drop a comment. Because the people who buried this man alive are counting on women like Amara talking themselves out of caring. Don't be the reason they get away with it. Like, subscribe, and stay. This only gets darker from here. Dirt has a sound when it gives up. A wet, grudging thunk, like the earth itself resents being interrupted. Amara heard it with every swing of the shovel, and somewhere around the 40th swing, her arms had stopped asking permission from her brain and just kept moving on autopilot, fueled by adrenaline and a stubbornness she didn't know she had until tonight decided to test it. The flashlight died at the worst possible moment. Because of course it did. That's the unwritten law of cheap batteries and expensive decisions. She kept digging in the dark, guided by nothing but the rhythm of those 3 knocks replaying in her skull like a song stuck on repeat. Except, this song had a body count attached to it if she got the timing wrong. Below her, Min-jae had stopped screaming. Not because he'd given up, because he no longer had the air to spare on something as useless as noise. He'd read once that the human body could survive roughly 6 minutes without oxygen before the damage became the kind you don't walk away from. He didn't know how long he'd been down here. Time in a coffin doesn't move like time anywhere else. It just presses. Then the shovel broke through. Not metaphor. Actual wood, actual splinters, actual rain pouring through the gap like the sky had been invited to the resurrection. Amara ripped at the opening with her bare hands, ignoring the way the wood bit into her palms, because somewhere beneath a foot of Korean soil was a person, and people don't get to become statistics on her watch. Not tonight. Not after everything that led her to this exact patch of cursed ground. Min-jae's fist met her shovel from below at the same moment she tore the lid free, and for one absurd second, both of them screamed. Him in relief, her in the specific terror of realizing the ground had just talked back. She hauled him up by the collar of a suit that used to cost more than her monthly rent, and he came out gasping, covered in the dirt of his own funeral, blinking up at a sky he never expected to see twice. "Run," he managed, the only word his lungs could afford. She should have. God, she should have. Instead, she looked past him and saw the flashlights. High on the ridge above the cemetery, headlights cut through the fog. Not one car, but several, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who'd never once in their lives worried about being caught. Ji-hoon's men. Not here to mourn. Here to confirm the job had stuck, the way you'd check a receipt to make sure you weren't overcharged for a murder. Find the grave. A voice crackled over a radio loud enough to carry across the wet air, and Amara understood with a sick, sinking certainty that she was currently standing inside the answer to that exact question. Min-jae, barely upright, barely breathing, fumbled at something sewn into the lining of his ruined jacket. A small waterproof pouch, the kind you'd use to keep a passport dry on vacation. Except, vacations don't usually end in premeditated burial. He pressed it into her hands with fingers that trembled from more than just the cold. They didn't bury a man, he wheezed, blood and dirt cracking his voice into something barely human. They buried evidence. I just never told them I made a backup. Inside the pouch, a flash drive, small enough to lose in a coat pocket, heavy enough to end careers, corporations, maybe entire branches of government. The retirement plan. Digitized, duplicated, and now, very inconveniently for the men on that ridge, very much alive. Amara stared at it, then at him, then at the headlights sliding down the hillside like a slow-motion collapse of everything she thought just teaching English abroad was supposed to mean. She'd come to Korea with a suitcase, a lesson plan, and a homesickness she managed by pretending it was character growth. She had not come here to become the reason a criminal empire either burned to the ground or hunted her for the rest of her life. And yet, here she stood, ankle-deep in mud, holding a dead man's insurance policy, while the people who buried him rolled closer with every second. The old man's warning echoed back at her, suddenly making a horrible kind of sense. Don't run. Funny. Now that running was the only sane option left, it was also the one thing she couldn't afford to do. There's a particular kind of stupid that only makes sense in hindsight, and Amara was fairly certain she just qualified for a graduate degree in it. She had exactly 2 options. Drop the flash drive, drop the half-dead crime lord, and sprint into the tree line like a reasonable human being. Or do the unreasonable thing, the thing that made no logical sense, the thing her grandmother back home would have called main character behavior and not the good kind. She chose the unreasonable thing. Hooking Min-jae's arm over her shoulder, she felt how little was left of him. A man who used to command silence from an entire city, now reduced to dead weight and ragged breathing. His expensive suit ruined, his empire evaporating in real time somewhere above ground. He'd have found it poetic if he had the energy to appreciate irony. Right now, he just found it exhausting. "You're going to get us both killed," he rasped, each word costing him something. "Cool," Amara shot back, dragging him toward the tree line as the flashlight swept closer. "Add it to the list of things nobody warned me about before I signed up to teach English abroad." Behind them, the SUVs crested the last hill, headlights slicing through fog like something out of a horror movie that had forgotten to cast an actual monster, because the monsters here wore tailored jackets and carried radios instead of knives. "Find the grave," the voice crackled again, closer now, and Amara understood that in about 90 seconds, someone was going to notice the grave in question had a hole in it, shaped like an escaped problem. They reached the tree line just as the first beam of light swept across the empty coffin, and Amara heard, faint but unmistakable, the specific silence of men realizing their evening had just gotten significantly more complicated. Let's pause here for a second, because if you're watching this and you've ever been the one person willing to dig when everyone else in the village decided to look away, comment below. Every system that thrives on silence needs people scared enough to stay quiet. Ji-hoon built an entire empire betting that nobody would dig. Prove him wrong. If you believe some things are worth the risk, hit subscribe, because the only people who won't are the ones hoping stories like this stay buried too. Min-jae slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow, dirt still crusted along his jaw like the earth hadn't finished making its point. "You don't understand what's on that drive," he said, quieter now, like a confession dragged out by proximity to death. "It's not just my ledger, it's proof. Politicians, corporations, half the men who just drove up that hill." He almost laughed, and it came out broken. "They didn't bury a man tonight. They buried their own bad decisions and hoped the dirt would keep the secret better than I did." Amara crouched beside him, pulse hammering, aware that every second spent talking was a second the men behind them didn't need to find the trail. "And what? I'm supposed to just walk into a war I didn't start, holding evidence against people who bury other people for a hobby?" "No," he said, meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd pulled him out of the ground. "You're supposed to survive it. I'll handle the rest, if there's a rest left to handle." That's when the first gunshot cracked through the trees, not aimed at them yet. More warning than intention. The kind of shot men fire when they want the forest to know they're serious. Amara didn't wait for a second one. She hauled Min-jae up again, ignoring his protest, ignoring the mud soaking through her shoes, ignoring every rational part of her brain screaming that this was exactly the kind of decision that got people written about in the news under a headline nobody wanted. They moved through the dark together. A broke teacher from a world Min-jae had never bothered to understand, and a crime lord who'd just learned, 6 feet underground, that loyalty really was just fear with better manners, and that the only person left willing to dig for him wasn't one of his men at all. Behind them, the flashlights fanned out, methodical, patient, closing the gap between confusion and certainty. Somewhere on that ridge, Ji-hoon would soon get the call nobody wants to make, that the grave was empty, that the ledger was loose, that the man he'd buried alive had come back up holding the exact thing capable of burying him instead. The hunt hadn't started. It had just changed direction. Ji-hoon got the call at 1:14 a.m., standing under an umbrella that did absolutely nothing against rain, determined to make a point. He listened without speaking, jaw tightening with every word, until finally he said the only thing a man says when a decade of careful planning collapses in real time. "Say that again." The grave was empty. Not disturbed. Empty. Shovel marks. Fresh footprints, 2 sets, heading into the tree line. And the pouch? The one thing Min-jae kept sewn into every jacket like a superstition. Gone. Ji-hoon closed his eyes and did the math a betrayer does at the worst possible moment. The math of how thoroughly he'd underestimated the man he thought he knew. He'd assumed grief, chaos, a clean transition of power. He hadn't assumed a stranger with a shovel and apparently zero self-preservation instinct. "Find them," he said, and hung up before his voice could betray anything else. Deeper in the woods, Amara's lungs burned in a way gym class never prepared her for. Min-jae stumbled beside her, weight sagging harder with every step. blood loss and oxygen debt catching up all at once. They found a maintenance shed near the cemetery's edge, rusted, forgotten, exactly the kind of place nobody checks first, which made it exactly the kind of place worth hiding in. "You need a doctor," Amara said, easing him down against a stack of rotted crates. "I need a phone," Min-jae corrected, voice thinner than before. "There's someone who can read what's on that drive and get it in front of people who can't be bought. A journalist. Foreign press, someone Ji-hoon's men can't touch as easily. And if they find us before you make that call?" He almost smiled, the expression cracking through dirt and dried blood like something trying to remember how it used to work. "Then you run. You don't owe me your life for saving mine." Amara studied him, really studied him, past the ruined suit and the criminal resume she'd absorbed in fragments over the last 20 minutes. She thought about the villagers who wouldn't set foot in that cemetery, about a system built entirely on people deciding some problems weren't worth digging into. She thought about the old man in the rain, gone before she could even ask his name, and wondered if he'd known exactly what he was setting into motion, or if he'd simply been the universe's messenger, paid in nothing but urgency. "I didn't dig you up to leave you in a shed," she said finally. "Where's this journalist?" They moved before dawn, sticking to back roads, avoiding anywhere with cameras or curious eyes. Min-jae directed from memory, safe houses he'd built for exactly this kind of catastrophe, though he'd always imagined himself the one giving the orders, not the one being carried between them. Somewhere around sunrise, in a shuttered noodle shop that owed him a favor older than Amara's entire time in the country, they finally got a working phone and a moment to breathe. The journalist's name was Soo-min, a woman who'd spent a decade being quietly threatened by exactly the kind of men Min-jae's ledger implicated, and who answered the call within 2 rings like she'd been waiting years for it. "Send it," she said, without pleasantries, without disbelief. "Send it now, before he changes his mind, before they find you, before any of the 100 things standing between you and safety happen first." Amara plugged in the drive with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking. Files uploaded in silence. Names, numbers. A decade of rot laid bare on a screen too small for the weight it carried. Min-jae watched his own downfall type itself into permanence, and for the first time since the coffin, something other than fear crossed his face. Relief, maybe, or the closest thing a man like him had left to redemption. "It's done," Soo-min said. "Once this goes out, they can't bury it again. Not the ledger. Not you." Outside, the first gray light of morning crept over rooftops that had no idea what was about to hit the headlines. Ji-hoon's men were still searching, still combing through forests and back roads, still confident that fear and silence would do what they'd always done. They didn't know the silence had already ended. They just hadn't heard it yet. The story broke at 6:02 a.m. Korean time, and by 6:15 had already stopped being news and started being a detonation. Soo-min didn't wait for confirmation, corroboration, or the luxury of caution. She'd learned long ago that men like Ji-hoon depended on journalists moving carefully while they moved fast. So she published everything at once. The ledger, the shipping records, the names of senators who'd golfed their way into corruption and corporations who'd used Min-jae's ports like a spin cycle for dirty money. No embargoes, no warnings, just the truth, dropped into the world like a grenade with the pin already gone. Amara watched it happen from a cracked plastic chair in the back of the noodle shop, phone screen lighting up with alerts in a language she still couldn't fully read, but somehow understood perfectly. Panic has a universal font. Min-jae, bandaged now with whatever the shop owner could scrounge, watched his own name trend across 3 countries with the strange, hollow calm of a man watching his own eulogy get better ratings than his actual funeral would have. "Ji-hoon's going to lose everything in about an hour," he said quietly. Ironic. He buried me to protect the empire. He just handed me the shovel to bury it properly. "You could have done this without almost dying," Amara pointed out. "I could have," he agreed. "But then you wouldn't have had a reason to start digging." She didn't have a comeback for that one. Ji-hoon found out the way most powerful men find out their world has ended, through a phone that wouldn't stop ringing with people no longer interested in protecting him. Board members resigning. Politicians disavowing decades of golf trips in real time. The senator who'd once called him an old friend, now referring to him in a live interview as someone I barely knew. Loyalty, it turned out, really was just fear with better manners. And now that the fear had shifted targets, so had the manners. He made it as far as the airport before the arrest, which felt, to anyone paying attention, almost too poetic to be real. A man who'd built his career on other people vanishing, trying, and failing to vanish himself. Cameras caught him being led through the terminal in handcuffs, expression flat. The practiced calm of a man who still hadn't accepted that calm wasn't currency anymore. Somewhere, in an evidence room that would soon be very crowded, a leather-bound black ledger, the original, still smelling faintly of grave dirt, was logged, tagged, and photographed as Exhibit A. By nightfall, Amara and Min-jae sat on the noodle shop's back steps, the adrenaline finally draining out of both of them in slow, exhausted waves. News vans circled somewhere blocks away, hunting for the woman who'd apparently dug a Mafia boss out of his own grave. A headline nobody could have written on purpose if they'd tried. "You'll be famous," Min-jae said, watching the last of the sunset bleed orange over rooftops that no longer belonged to men who thought they owned the city. "I'll be unemployed," Amara corrected. "Pretty sure accidentally exposed international corruption ring isn't covered under my teaching visa." He almost laughed. A real one this time. Rough at the edges, but genuine. "I have resources. Had resources. Some of them are apparently still mine, once the lawyers stop arguing about which parts of my empire were legally acquired versus criminally acquired." He glanced at her, something unguarded in his expression for the first time since she'd pulled him out of the dirt. "You could have let me die. Would have been easier." "Probably," Amara admitted. "But I made a promise to a stranger in the rain, and I don't break promises, even the confusing ones. Especially the confusing ones." Min-jae studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd walked into a cursed cemetery on nothing but a rumor and a shovel, who'd chosen to dig when every rational instinct told her to run, who'd carried a dying crime lord through the woods, not because she owed him anything, but because leaving felt worse than the risk of staying. "Then I owe you my life," he said. "And apparently, an entire criminal empire owes you its collapse." Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, real ones this time, chasing down the last of Ji-hoon's scattered loyalists, mopping up an empire that had crumbled in the space of a single news cycle. Amara leaned back against the steps, exhausted, muddy, and strangely lighter than she'd felt in months. The digging was over, but something told her the story wasn't quite finished yet. 3 weeks later, Amara sat in a courtroom she never expected to see the inside of, wearing a borrowed blazer and an expression she hoped read as composed, rather than still mildly traumatized by graveyard dirt. Ji-hoon sat across the room in a suit that no longer fit the man wearing it, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. Power, it turns out, is very good at making a suit look sharp. Guilt is not. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The ledger did the talking, page after page of names, dates, and numbers that dismantled a decade of carefully built silence in real time. Senators resigned before they were even called to testify. Corporations issued statements so full of legal hedging they practically confessed by accident. Ji-hoon's lawyer tried, valiantly and uselessly, to argue that a digitized ledger recovered from a graveyard lacked proper chain of custody, which earned him a look from the judge somewhere between disbelief and secondhand embarrassment. Amara testified for 11 minutes. She recounted the old man in the rain, the 3 knocks, the shovel, the fist meeting metal from below the earth, and watched, with a strange satisfaction, as several jurors' faces shifted from skepticism to something closer to awe. She left out the part where she'd questioned her own sanity for most of that night. Some details were hers to keep. Min-jae testified too, though not without irony thick enough to choke on. A crime lord serving as star witness against his own former empire, admitting to decades of corruption in exchange for a plea deal that traded prison time for cooperation and, more importantly, survival. He answered every question plainly, without the theatrical menace he'd once used like a second language. Fear, it seemed, had finally taught him the value of honesty. Or at least the value of honesty when the alternative was another grave, this time without a shovel waiting above it. Ji-hoon was convicted on 11 counts before the week was out. Bribery, conspiracy, attempted murder, the last of which the prosecutor delivered with a flourish clearly aimed at the cameras, because everyone in that courtroom understood the poetry of a man convicted of trying to bury the one person who could bury him back. Before we close this chapter, let's sit with something for a second. Ji-hoon spent a decade building a life on the belief that loyalty was just fear wearing better manners, that the people around him would stay silent as long as they were scared enough. If you've ever watched someone get away with something because everyone around them was too afraid to speak up, drop a comment below. Silence protects people like Ji-hoon. Speaking up protects people like Amara. If you believe the truth deserves better odds than fear does, hit subscribe, because the only people uncomfortable with that idea are the ones still hoping their own ledgers stay buried. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed with questions Amara had stopped bothering to answer politely around day 4. She'd become, against every plan she'd ever made for her life, the woman who dug up a mafia boss and helped topple half a criminal network by accident. Her visa situation had, unsurprisingly, resolved itself. Turns out governments move quickly when you're the key witness in the country's biggest corruption case in a decade. Min-jae found her on the courthouse steps, out of the ruined suit now, dressed simply. None of the old performance left in how he carried himself. Prison awaited him eventually, a reduced sentence, but a sentence nonetheless. The price of a plea deal and a decade of sins that couldn't simply be erased by good timing and a well-placed flash drive. "I don't get to walk away clean," he said. "I know that. I built the mess. I just didn't expect to be the one who survived cleaning it up." "Nobody walks away clean," Amara said. "Some people just get a second shot at not being the villain in their own story." He nodded slowly, looking at her the way you look at someone who changed the entire trajectory of your life over the course of one impossible night. "Whatever happens to me now, you gave me that shot. I won't waste it." Above them, the sky had finally cleared, sunlight breaking through clouds that had spent the last 3 weeks matching the mood of everyone involved. Somewhere behind them, in an evidence room slowly being emptied of its contents, a leather-bound ledger sat closed for the last time, its secrets no longer buried, its damage finally, irreversibly, done. 6 months later, Amara stood in front of a classroom again. Different country, same restless energy of kids who hadn't yet learned that adults don't actually have all the answers. She'd left Korea eventually, not because she wanted to, but because a woman who topples a criminal empire by accident tends to become a headline everywhere she goes, and headlines don't make for great parent-teacher conferences. She'd landed instead somewhere quieter, teaching English to a new batch of kids who had no idea their teacher once dug a man out of his own grave with a rusted shovel and a dying flashlight. She liked it that way. Some stories you carry privately, not because you're ashamed of them, but because they don't need an audience to be real. Ji-hoon's sentencing had made international news for exactly as long as these things do before the world moved on to the next scandal. 11 counts, a decade behind bars, an empire dismantled so thoroughly that shipping executives across 3 countries suddenly developed a very sincere interest in compliance training. The senators who'd golfed on stolen money mostly resigned in disgrace, a few facing charges of their own, proof that even the most carefully oiled machines of corruption eventually meet a shovel they didn't account for. Min-jae served 18 months, a fraction of what he might have faced, the price of full cooperation and a ledger that had done more damage to organized crime in Seoul than a decade of police work combined. He came out changed, or at least changed enough. Not a good man. Not exactly. Some debts don't get erased just because you helped burn down the empire that created them. But a man who no longer joked about loyalty being fear with better manners, because he'd learned, 6 feet underground, exactly what real loyalty looked like. It looked like a stranger who owed him nothing, choosing to dig anyway. He found Amara 2 years later, at a small cafe in a city she'd finally started calling home. No entourage, no tailored suit, just a man in a plain jacket, older around the eyes, carrying a duffel bag and an envelope he set carefully on her table before sitting down across from her. "I didn't come to complicate your life again," he said. "I came to say thank you properly, and to give you this." Inside the envelope, paperwork, a foundation, funded, ironically, by the seized remnants of his own former empire, the parts the courts allowed him to redirect rather than forfeit entirely, built to support investigative journalists and whistleblowers in countries where speaking up still got people killed. He'd named it, without asking her permission first, after the old man who'd started the whole thing with a warning in the rain and a face she'd never fully see again. "You don't have to run it," he said. "You don't have to be involved at all if you don't want to be. But I wanted you to know it exists. Because you didn't just save my life that night. You proved something I spent 35 years refusing to believe, that some people dig even when there's nothing in it for them. Amara looked at the paperwork, then at him, then out the window at a street that had nothing to do with cemeteries or coffins or corrupt senators, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the night she first heard 3 knocks rising out of the earth. "I'll think about it," she said, which, from her, was as good as a yes. That night, alone in her apartment, she thought about the old man in the rain, a face she still couldn't fully picture, a warning she never fully understood, a promise she'd kept to a stranger for reasons she couldn't entirely explain even now. Maybe he'd known exactly what he was setting in motion. Maybe he'd simply been the right person passing through at the right moment, the universe's messenger, gone before anyone could thank him properly. She thought about fear and how it had followed her into that cemetery and then, somehow, walked back out beside her instead of behind her. She thought about Ji-hoon, still sitting in a cell, having finally learned the one lesson his decade of scheming never taught him: that silence only holds as long as everyone agrees to keep digging their heels in instead of digging for the truth. The digging, she realized, had never really been about a grave. It had been about refusing to look away. And for the first time in a long while, Amara slept without dreaming of dirt, of coffins, of flashlights dying in the rain. Because some debts, once paid, finally let you rest.